So if you find this sleep story helpful or interesting, then give it a thumbs up, leave any comments that you've got below, and if you aren't already, subscribe to the channel and click the bell icon so you can receive notifications of when future sleep stories go live. I have dozens and dozens of stories already on my channel that you can go and search. I also release new stories every single week, so I hope you enjoy this story. Just take a moment to allow yourself to get comfortable and allow your eyes to close. And with your eyes closed, I'm just going to tell this guided sleep meditation in the background. And while I tell this sleep meditation, I don't know whether you'll drift asleep faster to the sound of my words or to the spaces between my words. And as you begin to comfortably drift asleep, you can have a sense of an old lady sat in a rocking chair on the porch of a farmhouse. And the old lady's just rocking backwards and forwards with that creaking of the rocking chair on the wooden floor. The sounds of birds flying high in the sky, looking out over that farm, looking out over the fields and the setting sun. And her grandchildren come to see her and talk to her, and they sit down cross-legged on the floor. And she starts to tell them a story. She tells them that this is a true story from her life. It's a story of intrigue, of wonder. A story so incredible, she's curious whether they'll even believe her as she tells it. And she begins to tell this story. She tells the children to sit down comfortably and relax. And if they want to let their eyes close, they can, while they listen along. And she talks about how many years ago, when she was a young woman, she went out on a ship. And she was sailing around the earth. She was going to sail to many countries. And as she sailed, she had a crew that came with her. And she had a book that she was following. And in this book was marked places that someone centuries earlier had travelled to, and the myths and legends they discovered on those lands. And she was curious what it was that led to these myths and legends. She'd imagined that the writings about a kraken, about a large sea monster, were probably just sightings of a large squid. Perhaps even sightings of whales breaching. And so she was sure that she could intellectually explain all of the writings in the book. And she wanted to rewrite this book factually, trying to find out what led to the author writing those myths. And across the sea, there was very little to see. There was no kraken, no sea monsters, just calm, open ocean. Whatever direction she looked, was just blue sea to the horizon, the occasional white, wispy cloud in the sky, and that boat just bobbing up and down. And after a few days, they approached the first piece of land, and she could see on the land that stuck out into the sea that there was some kind of a fort, and she could see the turrets on top of the fort, and she could see a light reflecting from the top, like someone was reflecting sunlight with a mirror. And she could notice that that was communicating a code with the flashes of the light. And they worked out that this code was communicating for them to come to shore in that location. So they headed over towards that fort. They docked that boat. The woman looked at her book, looked at where this place was, and saw that it was near a location that was in the book. So she decided while they're in port here, she would go and explore. So she rented a horse, and it was just a small Shetland pony. And she rode that Shetland pony, bouncing and bobbing up and down on its back, with its legs flailing around, trying to make it trot along rapidly. And its fast clippity-clopping along the dirt paths. And she rode that out from the settlement, through a valley, into some woodland, and on beyond the woodland to a river. And she kept checking her book to see where she was, how far she'd come, in relation to where that book said the author of the book had travelled. And she recognised that this river was on that map in the book. So she followed along, dismounted from the Shetland pony. She tied it to a tree to continue the little bit of journey she had left, taking her just up into a hill, on foot. And she could hear the sound of the flowing water. She could smell that freshness of the water. And she could see a cave up in the hills. And as she headed to those caves, she went to the largest one and realised there was a large cave and the others were almost like windows, just allowing more light in. And hanging in the main entrance was a metal container on a chain. And in the breeze that metal container was moving, swirling around. And there seemed to be some incense or something smelling fragrant coming out of that metal container as it swirled and moved in the breeze. And she noticed a very slight lightheadedness as she walked through that and into the cave. And she turned on a light. She aimed her light around inside the cave, looking at the cave walls. and she could see some drawings on the cave that looked like wild animals and people. And she walked deeper into the cave until she found what looked like a hole in the ground covered over with some wood. And so she moved that wood and could see a rope ladder leading down under this cave. She shone her light down the cave, down that hole. She counted that there were 10 rungs of the ladder. She couldn't hold the light and descend the ladder at the same time, so she turned the light off, put that in her pocket, and began to descend. 10, 9, and she counted her way down those rungs. 8, 7, 6, going deeper and deeper. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then she stepped onto the ground in this underground chamber beneath the cave. She got her light back out again, turned around, shone that around, before taking any steps, just to make sure everything was safe. She could notice the silence down here, how sound seemed to get lost in the walls, with barely any echo. How everything seemed so muted, the air seemed so still. And as she shone that light around, occasionally it would sparkle off of things on the walls. And so she went and explored, and she found a few crystals embedded in the dirt of the walls. And she found some stone slabs. And on those stone slabs, she could see markings that looked like writing, and she couldn't read that writing. But she had this sense that it was writing. And she carried on exploring. And she noticed that this chamber led into a corridor. She followed that corridor until she could hear the sound of running water. And she came out into a section of this cave that was illuminated by stringy blue fungus hanging from the ceiling, that was giving off the most beautiful blue glow, illuminating this cave, making that water seem to shine with an electric blue colour. And resting on the water, she could see what looked like a raft. And so she climbed onto that raft and decided to see where this goes. And with a pole that was on the raft, she pushes away from the edge, and the raft begins to move with the flowing water, and she uses that pole to prod down into the water, onto the bottom of this underground river, to help steer that raft. And she guides and steers that raft along this river. And then the river reaches some rapids that seemed to head downwards deeper and deeper underground. And she uses the pole to keep that raft at a manageable speed as it navigates the rapids. And she turns with the rapids and navigates successfully down those rapids, the occasional spray splashing up from the front of the raft. Until the rapids smooth out, and she finds herself in a lake, and there's still that blue glow. And she pulls the raft over to the side, disembarks that raft. She attaches the raft to the shore. She doesn't know if she'll use that to get back out of the cave at this point, or find an alternative way back up those rapids. But she's hoping she'll be able to find an alternative route than trying to force that raft against the flowing water back to where she came from. But for now she was curious where this place was. She could see that there was a door down here, and she wondered where that led. And she looked in her book, and she could see in the book that it talked about an underground kingdom of giants. And she knew that that was impossible, that perhaps there's just a tribe that was encountered that's a bit taller than normal, and that people centuries ago were generally shorter. So she walked through that door, opened the latch, closed it behind her, and was surprised to see what looked like a normal land. She could see a valley, she could see trees, she could see the blue sky and a sun in the sky. And she knew that she'd been travelling down deeper and deeper, and that there's no way that this could be the same place that she came from. And so she descended into the valley. And as she descended into the valley, she noticed that the trees were much taller than she at first realised. That everything looked normal from the door. It was just a valley to be descended into. And it was only from descending that she realised that she was actually very small in this area. The grass was above her waist, whereas normally the same looking grass would be up to her ankles. And the trees towered way overhead. And she could see a settlement off in the distance, and some smoke rising from some of the buildings. And she could see people walking around, people looking like they were working. She could see what looked like a marketplace. So she started heading down towards that settlement. And like with the grass and the trees, as she got closer to that settlement, she could hear the laughter of the people. She could see children running around and playing. but she realised that they towered well above her. That even with those young children that would normally be about 3/4 of her size, she was barely up to their waists. And with the adults, she was barely up to their kneecaps. And at first, she hid, feeling apprehensive and a bit scared. She'd heard stories of giants. Even in the book she'd read about these giants being scary creatures. But as she hid and observed these giants, so she noticed that they were behaving the same as anyone else. The children were having fun and playing. The adults were working and going about their daily lives. They were chatting, they were drinking. And she looked around her to try and get an idea of where this place was. And it looked like it went on in every direction as far as the eye can see. She couldn't see anything that looked remotely like where she came from. And so she couldn't work out where she was. And she decided to get closer to these giants. So she went and crept to one of the houses, snuck her way in through what looked like a cat flap, like a small little door space designed perhaps for a pet. And she crept into the kitchen and hid behind a table leg. And she could hear the giants in here just talking with each other and laughing. She couldn't understand what they were saying, but she could recognize the tonality. She could recognize the way that things were being said as being normal, everyday communication. Just friendly communication, like you would have with any friend or neighbour. And she climbed up onto a chair, climbed up onto the table so that she could get a better look. And while she was on the table, she accidentally made a bit of noise by knocking some cutlery. And so she went and hid behind a teapot. And it was the most beautiful metal teapot. And she hid behind that teapot, crouched down, curled up, as she could hear one of those giants walking over to investigate. And when the giant came over, they didn't at first see her. But then they caught a glimpse of her foot sticking out from behind the teapot, and they lifted up the teapot. And in her most charming voice, she just stood up, waved her hand and said hi, and started a conversation. And these giants didn't seem at all scary. They didn't know the language she was speaking, and she didn't understand their language. But they sat down, they watched while she talked, and they engaged. And she showed things that she had on her, and they showed things back. and somehow they managed to make the communication work. And she tried to explain who she was, where she was from. It didn't seem like they even knew that that door was there. And then one of them went away for a while before coming back with an enormous book, thudding that book down on the table, flicking through that book, and then pointing at a drawing in the book. And she couldn't read the text that went with the drawing, but she recognized that the drawing was of another small person visiting this land, and that this looked like it was something of a myth for this land, in the same way that to her giants were a myth. To this giant, small people were a myth. And they offered her some food, and she ate that food. And they were incredibly welcoming and kind. And she never knew where this place was. And after a while she left this place. She found her way back to that door. And she decided that she would try and climb up that river, up the rapids. It wasn't particularly deep. And so using the pole that came with the raft, she worked her way up through the rapids, found her way back, and out of the cave, and she wandered around those hills, trying to work out where that giant land was. And the only conclusion she could have was that somehow maybe there's some magic portal or something that connects two worlds with that door. And she couldn't find any logical explanation for this. She had to accept that what that adventurer had seen was real. And she found her way back to the boat. She tried to tell the crew what she'd seen, and they'd laughed, said she must have been drinking, or must be just trying to pull their legs. And she boarded that ship, and they set sail and carried on their journey. And after a few more days at sea, enjoying nights of watching suns set over the sea, of watching the moon rise, making the ocean glow with silver sparkles and a cloud of stars overhead, she could see a peninsula sticking out into the ocean. On the end of that peninsula was the tallest, brightest lighthouse that she'd ever seen. And she could see that in the book it talked about a magical lighthouse that at the same time as trying to warn you to keep away from the rocks, looks so incredible, you feel lured towards it. And so she told the crew to only approach in the daylight, so as being able to sail safely to that location rather than being lured there. And the next day, just after sunrise, they headed over towards that lighthouse, and they could see how beautiful and white that lighthouse was, how the stonework seemed to almost emanate light. And when they got as close to the shore as they could safely get, the woman got into a small boat and rowed the last bit of distance to the shore. And arriving on the shore, the woman went exploring. And like many of the locations, it seemed to be very overgrown by nature, tall trees, dense forest, or dense woodland. Vast, colourful and beautifully smelling meadows. And so she wandered through the meadows, through the woodland. She had to hack her way through. It was so dense. Before eventually coming out in a clearing where she could see this beautiful, sparkling, trickling stream just flowing out from the woodland down into those meadows. She could see butterflies, bees, birds, all darting in and out of that meadow. And the birds diving into that stream, flapping their wings, washing their wings, poking their heads into the stream, seeming to feel a sense of refreshment in this warm weather. And they seemed to be finding it so refreshing. She felt this sense of thirst and decided to scoop up some of that water, splash it on her face, and then drink a little of that water. And she drank some of that water and could feel that cool, refreshing water passing down through her body. And she was surprised to find that as she drank the water, so it was almost as if her aches and pains were fading away. And so she drank some more and some more as those aches and pains faded. And she felt almost invigorated by that water. And she filled a bottle with the water to take with her and carried on her journey following that stream. And at the end of the stream was a tiny lake, a lake so small it was barely a pond, but it was very deep, and it seemed that that water flowed down to this location and then must flow deep underground. And she dropped a coin into that pond. And at first she could see the high sun glistening off that coin as it sunk into the water. But then it seemed to keep going into the inky blackness, deep into that hole. and she was curious how far down that went. And she had a rope, and so she decided to tie a small rock to the end of that rope. She threw that into the hole, and she allowed that to sink as she held on to the rope. And it just kept descending deeper and deeper until she was holding just the very end of that rope. And she had to pull that back out because she didn't want to lose the rope. And so she knew that it was at least deeper than this rope. And she was curious why this water wore away at this location and led to this specific hole. And so she sat beside that pool of water, and as she did, she could see what looked like tiny goats making the most incredible sound. She wondered whether they were baby goats, but they were just so tiny. And then she saw that they had even tinier ones. And then she saw what looked like tiny hippos around some water way off in the distance, rolling into some mud. And she realized that there are a number of mammals on this island, on this location, that seem to be incredibly small. And this wasn't unusual for some places, but she found it intriguing that she'd come from a land of giants to now finding a land of small creatures that look familiar yet unusual. And she decided to carry on exploring. She drank some of that water from her bottle, and before setting off again she refilled that bottle. And every time she drank she felt this sense of well-being, this sense that somehow it was almost invigorating through her mind and body. She felt her mind was sharper, her vision was sharper. She felt more physically fit and active. And she didn't know if this was just in her mind. And as she continued to explore, she noticed the strangest thing. She could see this shiny looking stone that was the most incredible thing. It looked almost like a perfectly smooth red stone with some black dots on it. And it was about the size that she was. And as she approached, she noticed that it was actually familiar and was taken aback when she realized it was a human-sized ladybird that just seemed to be resting in the grass. And so she approached cautiously and carefully, but accidentally startled it as she got closer and could see the way it moved its shell out the way, inflated and stretched out its wings, almost like giant lace kites, and started to rapidly flap those wings. And then seeing its body rising up, its legs dangling beneath it, and feeling almost like someone's fanning her face. The pressure of the air being displaced by the flapping of those wings, and the almost rumbling buzz of that ladybird taking off and flying off. And suddenly she realized that there were a few different insects like that she hadn't at first noticed because they were so out of place, that seemed to have grown extremely large here. And that there was something strange about this land. And she wondered whether it had something to do with that water. She didn't know if she was seeing things because of the water. And she found a space under a tree. She got that book out. She continued to read. And she read about that lighthouse. She read about this strange land here. About the giant insects that she had just dismissed as being perhaps just slightly larger than average. And it didn't say anything about the small animals. But it talked about a strange building, a circular stone building here. And that somehow, in that circular stone building, is the reason for the strangeness in this land. And she tried to work out on the map where that circular stone building is. And she had to head back into the dense woodland. And she pushed on through that dense woodland in the direction where that stone building should be. And in the book it looked like this used to be on the edge of the dense woodland, but that woodland has gradually been reclaiming this land over the centuries, as people don't really visit here. And she found that stone building, and it looked like it was the same kind of stone as the lighthouse, that it seemed like the stonework itself almost emanated and glowed light. And she walked around that building, and she found a white door. She opened that white door. She walked inside that white door to see just an oval room, and around the entire wall were doors. It just seemed to be a room of doors. And yet she knew, having walked around the building to find this door, that this was the only door. And she looked behind herself and saw that the door she had just walked through looked exactly the same as every other door in this room. And she decided, just to be sure, that she would leave a mark on this door. So she got out a crystal that she'd picked up while in the caves, and she scratched on the door a number 1 so that she knew which door she came in and which door to leave through. And although she was very confident that this door was the door she'd come in through, and so this door was the door she should leave through, she opened the door just to double check, given that her experiences have been unusual. And when she opened the door, it was the correct door. And she wondered what could be behind the other doors. She expected that behind each of the other doors would just be a wall, because there's nothing else that could be there. And she looked in the book, and the book said that many of the places that they had travelled to were connected with this building, almost like taking a map, putting a map on a wall, putting little pins in every location you visited, and then finding a central location and placing a pin there, and then placing a thread between each pin and that central location, and knowing if you head out from that central location in any of those threads, you'll go to one of those other places. And they even include a drawing that looks very much like that. And she had read it as being a misunderstanding of maps, when the person who'd written this book had described this place as the centre of the world, when she knew that there was technically no real centre of the world. There was a North Pole, a South Pole, and then there was countries, there was continents, and oceans. There wasn't an actual centre to the world. So she assumed that it was just a misunderstanding. Perhaps through being too naive, given how fantastical some of the tales were. And as she went to the first door and opened up that first door, she suddenly felt freezing cold. And she could see snow. And she walked through that door. And she was cold and shivering. But she wanted to check it out and see what was here. And she could hear the howling wind. She could see snow blowing across the land. And she was near the coast. And she could see the ice stretched out over the sea. And she walked a little way over that ice. And then she saw the most incredible sight. She saw a narwhal poking its head up out of the water and then splashing back down into the water again. And she thought to herself about those people that have misinterpreted them as somehow being like unicorns or related to unicorns in some way, or being some other mystical being. And she knew that it shouldn't have been possible for her to be here from walking through that door. And she closed that door behind her as she went back into the room. And she could instantly feel the warmth of this location again, that felt so much more refreshing, having come in out of the cold. And she opened the next door and was surprised to see that it was night time. She could see the curtain of stars. She could see some shooting stars she could see that moon in the sky, and the moon was at a slightly different angle to what she saw it the previous night, so she knew she must be in a different location on Earth. But here it was still a comfortable temperature, and she didn't want to get lost from the door, so she left the door open, and she left a light at the door, so that as she walks away from that door, although there's some light in the room, she wanted to make sure she could definitely find her way back. And she could feel herself walking through tall grass, and as she did occasionally, she would disturb plants and see clouds of fireflies launching up into the sky, and see the green flickering and dancing of those fireflies in the sky. And then she heard a snort and some loud breathing, and could hear some running water. And she could see the water with the glistening from the moon, and could see a shadowy figure. And so she carefully, quietly approached that shadowy figure, approached that water. And she realized that it seemed to be the head and body of a man, but the legs and back of perhaps some kind of animal, almost like a horse. And as they noticed her, they were startled, and they jumped back. And again they seemed to be able to communicate with a complex language, but she couldn't understand their language and they couldn't understand hers. But they approached with curiosity, and she approached them with curiosity. And as they got near each other, they bowed their head low, as if to signal friendship and peace. And so she copied and bowed her head. And then they looked back at each other, and she held a hand out, and they held a hand out, and she taught them to shake hands. And they were inquisitive about each other. And when they knew they couldn't communicate with language, they reduced the amount of verbal language they used, just making sounds while communicating non-verbally. And they led her around to their family. And she saw that there were even more, that there were herds of these creatures which looked very human at the front end and looked almost horse-like for the rest of their body. And she could see the males, the females, the children. And they're all curious about her, and they were walking around her, curious about how she only seemed to have 2 legs. And they nuzzled and touched at her clothes, curious about how she was wearing clothes. And then she saw sparkling coming down from the sky, and could hear a buzzing by one ear and then by the other ear, and she instinctively tried swatting it away. before hearing a small voice, a slightly squeaky voice, and realizing that it was a small green fairy. And it hovered in front of her, and it began to talk, and she was surprised to find that she could understand it. And the fairy explained that they were magic, and being magic, they can communicate in any language, and so they can understand each other. And the fairy said that they can help her to communicate with others just as easily. And the fairy flew off and said, "Follow me." And so the woman followed that fairy and had to run to keep up. And the fairy went to a small stream. And that stream was bubbling, and she could tell that this stream was bubbling because it was a spring. And around the edge of this spring, she could see some glowing mushrooms just illuminating the outside of the spring. And the fairy said to scoop up some of this water and drink some of this water, that this water mixes with the roots of the mushrooms, and these mushrooms connect with all living beings. And so by mixing with the roots of the mushrooms, drinking this water will allow you to be able to communicate with all animals. And so she drinks some of that water, and the fairy explains that this won't last forever. And so she drinks some of the water from her water bottle as well, and then scoops up some of this water in her water bottle, feeling that she may want to try this again later. And then she finds that she can communicate with these animals here, with these beings here. She can learn more about them. And the fairy tells her that there are many realms connected. And that the location she's found is the center of those realms. It's like the hub of those realms. That there are many other portals to those realms that can be found. But a wizard, many thousands of years ago, had lived out on a remote location, had created a lighthouse, had created a hub connecting to the realms, so that they wouldn't have to travel to each gateway to the different realms. Instead, they had all the realms where they were. And that centuries ago, another explorer found this location. And she went back into that room, and she explored more of the doors. Walking through one door, she found the most beautiful palaces with the most incredible mosaic floors that echoed and reverberated with each footstep seeming to make the most perfect pitch. Lands which had palaces stretching high into the sky. Lands with dragons. lands with all sorts of creatures that seem mythical to us in our normal world. And she realized that everything that was written down about these myths and legends in these different cultures had a seed of truth, that people were just discovering these realms, almost like alternative Earths overlaying normal Earth, where every possibility is a possibility. And they would pass into another realm, but on their trips they would find their way out. Sometimes a realm would randomly fall into sync with the earthly realm. It would seem almost like a cloud descending on that location. Almost like someone's played a guitar string and another string has started to vibrate in sympathy. And for a moment, the two realms merge. And then you either pass out of that location and are just back in your normal location, like passing out of a bubble, passing through a cloud. Or they go back out of sync with each other again, and the realm disappears. And in most cases, you're back in your normal realm. And in rare cases, ships will disappear into the other realms, perhaps never to find their way back. And the woman checked out the different rooms, checked out those different doors. And after visiting many of those realms, she went back through that first door. She found her way back to the shore. She rowed back to the boat. They raised the anchor and carried on their journey. And she knew now that whatever they find for the rest of this journey will probably just be more of the entrances to these realms, and that what had been written down hundreds of years earlier was true. They weren't just myths. There was nothing for her to intellectually debunk. She's now realized that she just needed to open her mind to how much there can be out there and the possibilities. And she continued her journey, eventually arriving back in her own country, and then spending years writing up a book about her adventures, telling her stories. And now sitting, rocking in that chair, telling her grandchildren, having those children enthralled with her words, captivated by fascinating creatures, lands of giants, dragons, palaces. She takes 2 copies of her book that she's got beside her. She writes their names in those books. She tells them these are the only 2 copies of this book. No one ever allowed it to be printed. No one ever believed her. No one ever opened their mind to the possibilities and the wonder of the world. And so she told her story anyway. She printed her books herself, just to pass down in her family, to help these stories continue on, to help the myths and legends continue on into the future. To hope that one day future generations will go off and investigate these things for themselves, will follow the clues in the books. And the children were so excited by being given these books. And then the grandmother said, "It's time for bed." She showed them up to their room, settled them down in their beds, kissed them both on the forehead, gave them a big hug, told them that she loved them, turned off the light, and having had a story told, they quickly fell asleep with their minds racing with imagination and wonder, as children do. And with a smile on her face and happy to have shared with her young grandchildren these stories that for the first time in years she's been listened to and heard rather than ignored and laughed at. She sits by a fire. She drinks a warm, comfortable drink before turning the lights off, heading to bed herself. And as she begins to fall asleep, she looks over on the nightstand and she can see a little crystal bracelet that she was given in one of those realms that she'd revisited a number of times. It was a realm where she'd met her soulmate, and they maintained a connection through that crystal bracelet as a way of her accessing their realm, and they can visit her in her realm, and she just has to wear that bracelet, and it connects almost like connecting the electromagnetic pulse of her heart that synchronizes with her soulmate, and the realms merge, and they can see each other, walk towards each other, spend time together. And for years they've shared that magical relationship, and every night she looks at that bracelet, reaches over, gently touches that bracelet with her fingertips, before tucking herself up in bed, pulling her arms in under the covers, pulling the covers up round her neck, and drifting and floating so comfortably and relaxed asleep.